Imagine a young man who had everything the world could offer: wealth, status, education, and a bright future. He was heir to a vast fortune, destined for power and luxury. Yet, instead of living for himself, he made a decision that shocked his family, puzzled his friends, and inspired thousands. At just 16 years old, while traveling the world, his heart broke as he saw souls without Christ. From that moment on, he turned his back on riches and chose the narrow path of surrender. While others chased fame and fortune, this young millionaire chose a different road, a narrow way marked by prayer, sacrifice, and surrender. While others sought career and comfort, he knelt in prayer, gave to the poor, and dreamed of reaching the hardest mission fields. And the result? A movement that shook Yale University, stirred the United States, and sent countless young men and women to the mission field. His life ended at only 25 years old, but his legacy still challenges us more than a century later. His name was William Borden, the millionaire who wanted to be a missionary and gave everything for Christ. This isn't just the story of a wealthy young man who gave up his inheritance. This is the story of how God used one life, fully surrendered, to awaken thousands to the missionary call. Years later, biographers would sum up his life in 3 short phrases: no reserves, no retreats, no regrets. If you believe that God can still use a surrendered life to awaken a generation, write in the comments, no reserves, no retreats, no regrets. By writing these words, you're not just repeating Borden's story, you're declaring that you too want to live fully yielded to Christ. Now let's dive into this story, a story that will deeply touch your heart. William Whiting Borden was born in 1887 into one of the wealthiest and most respected families in Chicago. His father had made a fortune in silver mining in Colorado and later in real estate. From the very beginning, William's life seemed destined for privilege and ease. He grew up in an influential family with every opportunity wealth could provide. But behind the polished image of prosperity, something deeper was stirring. When William was still a boy, his mother experienced a powerful conversion and began taking him to the Chicago Avenue Church, later known as Moody Church. It was there, under the preaching of evangelist R.A. Torrey, that young William personally encountered the gospel. Prayer and the study of Scripture became habits that shaped his life from that moment on. At 16, after completing his studies at the Hill School in Pennsylvania, William received an unusual graduation gift: a trip around the world. For most young men of his background, such a gift meant adventure, leisure, and luxury. But for William, it became something altogether different. As he traveled through Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, he came face to face with poverty, suffering, and above all, the spiritual darkness of people who had never heard of Christ. From the palaces of Europe to the crowded streets of Asia, William saw the stark contrast between wealth and despair, privilege and hopelessness. And somewhere along that journey, his heart was captured by a calling greater than comfort or career. In a letter home, he wrote simply of his growing desire: "I want to be a missionary." What seemed to others like the dream life of a millionaire's son became, for William, a sacred burden. While the world expected him to inherit fortune and fame, God was preparing him for something radically different. And yet, this was only the beginning, because when William returned home with this new determination, the reaction he would face would test the depth of his conviction. That trip around the world, at just 16 years old, was meant to broaden William's horizons, to prepare him for a future of leadership and privilege. But instead, it shattered his illusions about what really mattered. In Asia, he saw multitudes trapped in poverty and spiritual darkness. In the Middle East, he witnessed deep devotion, but devotion without the light of Christ. In Europe, he recognized both the cultural brilliance and the emptiness of hearts untouched by the gospel. Wherever he turned, the same question echoed in his mind: who will tell them about Jesus? It was no longer about tourism or adventure. For William, this journey had become a sacred confrontation. The world was vast, fragmented, and lost, and he could no longer ignore it. From the deck of the ship, he wrote letters home, filled with an unusual urgency for someone his age. His words were clear and simple. "I want to give my life as a missionary." For friends back home, it made no sense. "A missionary? He's throwing his life away," some whispered. But William was unmoved. It wasn't a passing emotion. It was a calling that had taken root deep in his soul. And in the quiet of those days, between train rides, seaports, and foreign cities, William decided something in his heart. He would no longer live for himself. Wealth, prestige, success, all of it would bow before the cross of Christ. It was there, as a teenager traveling the world, that the first phrase began to burn within his soul: no reserves. He returned home a changed young man. Yet his decision was about to collide head-on with the expectations of his family and the ambitions of society. When William returned from his trip, the news spread quickly among relatives and friends. The young millionaire heir had decided to become a missionary. To many, it sounded like madness. "Why waste your life?" some said. "He has the world at his feet, and he chooses to throw it away?" Others scoffed. Even those closest to him struggled to understand. Businessmen imagined him as the future head of major enterprises. Society expected him to be a leader among America's elite. Instead, William spoke of nations in darkness, of people who had never heard the gospel, of a calling that demanded everything of him. The criticism was real and the pressure heavy, but William did not waver. They say he wrote 2 words in his Bible that defined this stage of his journey: no reserves. He would hold nothing back. His education, his influence, his wealth, even his very life, all belonged to Christ. One of his biographers later wrote, "He had already given himself, body and soul, to Christ, and truly lived that way." His classmates would soon testify that Borden was unlike anyone they had ever known. His conviction was unshakable, his determination firm, and his eyes fixed on eternity. What looked like a waste to the world was, in William's heart, the only path worth walking. Yet this decision wasn't the end of his struggle. It was only the beginning, because when he arrived at Yale, the battle between comfort and calling would become even more intense. In the fall of 1905, William Borden arrived at Yale University. To most, he seemed like just another freshman, though wealth and privilege marked his background. But it didn't take long for his classmates to realize there was something different about him. One classmate later said, "He came to college far ahead, spiritually, of any of us. He had already given himself, body and soul, to Christ, and really lived it. We, his classmates, learned to lean on him and to find in him a strength as solid as a rock." At the beginning of his first semester, William wrote in his personal journal the conviction that guided everything he did: say no to self and yes to Jesus every time. He was soon disheartened by the spiritual emptiness he saw on campus. For Borden, Yale's culture of humanistic ambition without Christ led only to weakness and ruin. So, quietly, he began something that would transform the university. Along with a friend, he started meeting every morning before breakfast to read scripture and pray. Within weeks, 2 more joined, then a dozen, then dozens more. By the end of the first year, 150 students were meeting weekly. By his senior year, more than 1,000 of Yale's 1,300 students were part of these groups. William didn't just pursue the eager or the religious, he deliberately sought out those everyone else avoided. When the student leaders divided up the names of classmates to contact, there was always hesitation over the hardest cases, the so-called hopeless ones. That's when William broke the silence. "Put him down for me." But his ministry didn't stop at Yale's gates. At night, William could be found walking the streets of New Haven, among the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the drunks. He bought meals in cheap restaurants, sat in modest boarding houses, and prayed with men who had lost everything. With his own money, he founded the Yale Hope Mission, a refuge for the downtrodden, where the love of Christ was preached not only in words, but in bread, shelter, and compassion. A visitor from England later said the most unforgettable thing he saw in America wasn't a monument or a landmark, but a young millionaire kneeling with his arm around a tramp at the Yale Hope Mission. It was clear William Borden's wealth did not possess him. Christ did. And the fire that began with a handful of students was now burning through an entire university. But even this was not the end of his journey, because soon God would open doors far beyond Yale, doors that would test whether William truly meant to give everything for the cause of the gospel. When William graduated from Yale in 1909, his reputation was already established. He was known not only as one of the strongest leaders on campus, but also as a man of unshakable convictions. Opportunities now came rushing his way. Business leaders offered him prestigious positions with enormous salaries. Relatives envisioned him taking charge of the Borden fortune. Academic doors also opened, Harvard, Princeton, and others. For most, these would have been irresistible paths to success, but William had already decided. He turned down every lucrative offer. His future was not in boardrooms or positions of power. His future was in the mission field. Choosing Princeton Theological Seminary, he devoted himself to deeper study of scripture, theology, and missions. Professors and classmates felt his influence. One of his mentors, Professor Charles Erdman, later wrote, "No other student has ever made such an impression on me." His consecration to Christ and his confidence in prayer were a constant inspiration. It was during these years that the second phrase, often linked to his life, rang true: no retreats. William would not turn back. He had put his hand to the plow, and there was no returning to comfort or promises of wealth. Yet the weight of that decision was not light. Walking away from millions, from prestige, from a life most could only dream of, meant swimming against every current of his culture. But William's eyes were fixed on something greater, on Christ and on a world waiting to hear the gospel. And soon, that vision would narrow even further as God placed a specific people on his heart, the Muslims of northwest China. At Princeton, William's passion for missions gained sharper focus. At a student volunteer movement convention in Nashville, he heard Samuel Zwemer, the great apostle to Islam, speak about the vast and unreached Muslim world. Zwemer held up a map and pointed to the millions who had never heard the gospel. For William, it was like a flame being fanned into a blazing fire. He fixed his eyes on one of the hardest places on earth, the Hui Muslims in Gansu Province, northwest China. The region was remote, resistant, and spiritually dark. Few missionaries had dared to go, and fewer still had remained. But William was undeterred. The greater the challenge, the stronger his resolve. Friends admired his boldness, though many thought him unrealistic. "Why not serve here in America, where you can influence thousands?" they asked. "Why risk everything for a place so far, so difficult, so closed?" But William's answer was his very life. He believed the words of Christ in Matthew 16. "Whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it." For William, there was no safer place than in the center of God's will. With his plans laid out, he prepared with discipline. He invested his wealth in missionary organizations, supported evangelistic efforts around the world, and challenged his peers to consider God's call beyond their borders. Yet, he knew he had to be prepared. That meant not only theological training, but also mastery of the languages and cultures he would face. And so, in 1912, after graduating from Princeton Seminary, William set out for the mission field. But instead of sailing directly to China, he made an important stop. To reach the Muslims of Gansu, he would first need to learn Arabic and study Islam at its roots. His path led him to the Middle East, to Cairo, Egypt. But what awaited him there would test his faith more deeply than ever. At the end of 1912, William Borden arrived in Cairo, Egypt. His plan was clear. Before heading to the remote province of Gansu, he would immerse himself in Arabic and Islamic studies. To reach the Hui Muslims of China, he needed to understand their faith, their mindset, their world. He stayed with a Syrian Christian family, practicing Arabic daily. Hearing the language in its natural rhythm, he walked the streets, spoke with locals, and even distributed Christian tracts written in a style that echoed the cadence of the Quran. For William, every step was preparation. Every day was one step closer to China. But then, in March of 1913, something unexpected happened. He felt severe headaches and soon became gravely ill. The diagnosis was meningitis. Within weeks, his body weakened and the disease advanced quickly. On April 9, 1913, William Borden died in Cairo at just 25 years old. The shock reverberated around the world. His mother, who had traveled to the Middle East to spend time with him, arrived just in time to be with him in his final days. A simple funeral was held, attended by missionaries and friends, including Samuel Zwemer himself. He was buried in the American Cemetery in Cairo. On his tombstone were inscribed the words suggested by Professor Charles Erdman: "Apart from Christ, there is no explanation for such a life." To many, it seemed like a tragedy, a waste. A wealthy, talented, visionary young man, gone before even reaching his mission field. But was it really the end? Because the ripple of his short life was only beginning to spread. The news of William Borden's death spread across the United States like a shockwave. Headlines in major newspapers reported, "A young millionaire, heir to fortune and influence, had died at 25, not in wealth and comfort, but in a distant land, preparing to give his life for the gospel." At Yale, where hundreds had prayed with him, students wept. At Princeton, where professors admired his devotion, memorial services were filled with testimonies of his faith. Across America, churches retold his story. Even in places as far as Japan, Korea, India, and South Africa, memorials were held in his honor. Why? Because William's death was not seen as waste, but as seed. His choice to give everything for Christ, wealth, career, comfort, and even life itself, challenged an entire generation of young believers. Many who had hesitated now stepped forward. Some applied to missionary agencies, others gave sacrificially to support the cause. His financial legacy also continued to speak. William had left $800,000, a massive sum at the time, for missionary organizations, including the China Inland Mission. With that gift, a hospital was built in Lanzhou, Gansu Province, called the Borden Memorial Hospital, serving precisely the people he had longed to reach. A classmate once said of him, "He was made of the same stuff as martyrs and missionaries." Though William never set foot in China, his life became a spark that lit countless torches. His story was told in sermons, in missionary conferences, in books, and it still is, more than a century later. Looking at William Borden's life, it's easy to focus on what he gave up. He walked away from fortune, rejected prestigious careers, turned his back on the comforts of wealth. He never reached his intended mission field. To the world's eyes, it looked like loss, but in God's eyes, it was gain. Because William understood a truth many never grasp. True riches aren't measured by what we keep, but by what we give to Christ. His story is not about a young man who died too soon, but about a life that still speaks through the generations. The phrases often associated with his memory still echo today. No reserves, no retreats, no regrets. Though historians debate whether he actually wrote those words in his Bible, they perfectly capture the testimony of his life. William Borden lived with no reserves, holding nothing back from God. He never retreated, never turned from his calling, and in the end, he had no regrets because he had already given everything to Christ. Brothers and sisters, his story leaves us with a challenge. What are we living for? Are we building our lives around comfort, wealth, and recognition? Or are we willing to say, like Borden, "Lord, my life is yours"? Perhaps you'll never inherit a fortune, travel the world, or study at elite universities, but the call remains the same: surrender. Because God isn't looking for wealth, influence, or talent. He's looking for hearts fully yielded to him. William Borden's life ended at 25, but his impact still lifts us higher. If this testimony touched your heart, and if the video is already posted, watch now the story of Charles Studd, another wealthy missionary who gave his fortune and his health for Christ.